Ever since the Cometians, that the Greeks called Egyptians, originated what we call philosophy, which is really an activity that is centered in the human mind. Philosophy had migrated to the West via Greece, and the humble and secure Greek philosophers, beginning with Plato through Aristotle, and a list of them humbly pay homage and tribute to the Cometian priests in which they learned how to philosophize, which in the course of time led the great Plato himself to renuminate and say the following: until kings learn how to philosophize, and the philosophy itself becomes a genuine and adequate activity, that rulers should also philosophize, the world as we know it will neither be prosperous or happy, the philosopher mused. This yearning for aligning philosophy with politics or leadership to have an organizing principle called philosophy, this yearning really has not been realized until recently. One of the greatest philosophers of our time, and I really mean this from my heart, variously described as a titanic intellect, that he is a philosopher with a prophetic voice and an analytic mind, and a philosopher who cares for the world, arrives on the American scene and is now seeking to run for what he calls truth and justice, not merely running for the institution of the presidency. Professor Cornel West does not need any introduction. Among other things, he's the author of 20 books. He's a frequent guest in websites, radio programs, all kinds of activities and invitations in which he generously participates. And now he is so generous, considering how busy he is, as you can imagine, that he has decided for the fourth time, I think, to appear in our television program, African Ascent International, to philosophize with us. His quest is to realize Plato's proposition, which was outlined on page 473, as it were, to sound pedantic, in Plato's book 5, at the expense of embarrassing him, because he's characteristically humble, a blend of his revolutionary Christianity and also his philosophical temperament. I am bringing him to show us how it is that we can integrate philosophy and politics today. Professor Cornel West, I must thank you for appearing in African Ascent International, and as you recall, 3 of your interviews were already converted into a book, and I'll flag the book at the end of the program. So today, what I have in mind that I and you could do is going to be strictly philosophical. Unless it is necessary, I will not ask you political questions, because you've been getting bombarded by them in 100 and 200 interviews in various websites. And the last thing that you want to do, I know your temperament is to repeat yourself. So today, we're going to bring philosophy to the masses, since you're yearning to make that Platonic proposition real and exhibit the subtle ways by which philosophy could guide leadership, and leadership itself could be an adequate and rigorous practice of philosophizing. So my themes are essentially going to be 3. I would like us to talk as deeply as we can, philosophically, what human nature means to you. And then that would lead us to analyze philosophically the status and the meaning of appearances that human beings unnecessarily make much too much of, namely race, gender, sex, and class. Let's begin with reflecting on what human nature means to you and what you expect from all these human beings whom you are attempting to engage philosophically and encourage them to vote for you, since you are running as an independent, which is characteristically a philosophical temperament?
First, I want to say that it's always a blessing to be in conversation with you, my dear brother. That you remain a towering figure in the philosophical discourse, not just in America, but the world. I've said this a number of times. I said this in the book that we had such a good time writing and working on together. But thank you so much for allowing me to come back. And you are absolutely right. It is very rare that I get a chance to engage in philosophical discourse, not just during the campaign in many ways, but these days, even in public life. So to be able to zero in on a question like human nature, very complicated, of course, because human nature is a combination of the biological and the cultural, of nature and nurture, of sets of instincts and appetites, because we are animals. We are animals with a language, as Aristotle would put it, animals with logos, with rationality. But we're also more than that. We also have personalities and spirits that allow us to transcend and transform our appetites and our instincts into something called habits, as John Dewey would put it in his great work, Human Nature and Human Conduct of 1922. Habits and practices. So that on the one hand, you've got the degree to which we are these animals in the world, driven by certain instincts and appetites. On the other hand, we are animals with language, with spirit, with personalities, who are socialized in such a way that we can transcend and transform not just our circumstances and conditions, but our very appetites and our very instincts. We can never eliminate them, but we can educate them. That's why paideia sits at the very center of any philosophical discourse. Plato's right about that in the Republic. That's why the Republic is very much, as Rousseau said, it's a text on education more than it is on anything else, because he's trying to displace Homer, who was the source of paideia in Greece. He's trying to displace the poets with philosophy. Philosophy becomes the center, the source. You remember 607b5 in Book 10 of the Republic, the traditional quarrel between philosophy and poetry. And he's already engaged in his indictment of Homer, and he's trying to initiate through the figure Socrates, and given his mentor and master Socrates, who was killed by the demos in Athens. He's going to make the world safe for Socrates by allowing Socrates to provide a whole new conception of education that has with it a certain kind of politics, the philosopher kings, those who have access to the idea of agathon, those who have access to the idea of the good, believing, in fact, that the masses of human beings are driven just by appetite and driven just by what he called thumos, spiritedness. They become the soldiers, they become the guards. And knowledge and wisdom is residing in the hearts, minds, and souls of these philosophers, who will guide as they emerge out of the cave, out of the darkness, out of the space of shadows, and actually have a sense of reality, which is beneath the appearances, of the knowledge, which is beneath opinion. And in that sense, as you know, I come from a tradition of radical Democrat, small d. So I don't have the kind of anti-democratic sensibility that Plato does. When I think of myself as a particular moment in movements, a moment within my family, a moment within my community, a moment within my tradition. But these are movements from below. These are movements of a hated people, a terrorized people, a traumatized people, an oppressed people. And we're looking at the world through the lens of those sufferings and transforming and transcending those sufferings by means of our minds, so we think more clearly, by means of our hearts, so that we have a deep sense of feeling and sensitivity to the suffering, not just of our own families and groups, but of everybody, not even beyond humanity, even sentient creatures, of dogs and cats and so forth. And most importantly, and this is where I do agree with Plato and Socrates, that it really comes down to courage, though, brother. You see, that philosophy at its deepest level is a mustering the courage to think critically in such a way that you can act more courageously and compassionately, so that any philosophical discourse is tied to discourse about virtues. And any discourse of virtues has to deal with the enabling virtue, which is courage. All the other virtues are empty if there's no courage. If there's only cowardliness, then any kind of talk about virtue is shattered, because the moment you have to be courageous, people are not courageous, they're cowardly. And if they're cowardly, then there is no philosophical discourse across the board. Now, of course, theologically, we can just put it in terms of God can't use cowards. So that one's relation to the most powerful forces in the universe. If you are part of that relation but have no courage, then in the end it's empty, it's shallow, it's vacuous, it's hollow, as T.S. Eliot would put it in that great poem, 1930, The Hollow Men. And so I think the crucial thing, especially in our day and time, is how do we enable courage in a moment in which it looks as if morality and spirituality have no place in an age of barbarity? Because an age of barbarity is simply saying to people, give up on moral courage, appeal to your appetite and instincts, which tend to be narcissistic or tribal, be concerned only about your folk, and it's all might makes right, it's all power dictates any morality, it's all stronger crush the weaker by means of military equipment, by means of military technology. Now, that's always been part and parcel of the human story. We know that. That's the history of the human species. Hatred organized, greed organized, fear manipulated, exploitation, domination. But philosophy provides that love of wisdom, those moments of interruption that try to hold back the hatred, hold back the greed, hold back the fear, hold back the domination, hold back the exploitation, and allow for not just Socratic dialogue, but a shattering of indifference toward the suffering of others, a shattering of callousness toward the suffering of others, that opens these moments of interruption, of sensitivity, of Socratic dialogue, of genuine exchange, of critical self-examination, and in the end, of courageous action, courageous praxis, as our Marxist comrades would put it, DC.
That was quite a discourse. I did not expect anything less. Pursuing that theme, Professor Cornel West, let's now get into this tension, as you know, that Plato was the first to rigorously analyze between appearances and truth, such that race in particular, as well as gender, as well as sex, are really, in the end, correct me if I'm wrong, appearances, and to that degree, only partial truths. Whereas the self itself is much more than these appearances, because the self is a realization of truth with capital T. But these appearances, which are partial components of it, interrupt the possibility of the self to fully realize itself as intelligent, morally organized, and capable of autonomously thinking for itself, while it is shadowed by and conditioned by, socialized by these partial truths that empty the self in the end of its possibilities. Your candidacy is a very courageous attempt to penetrate these partial truths, and as you said when you introduced yourself, to push the self to realize its possibilities, and also push yourself to maximally give the best of you to the voters to whom you will be appealing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, appreciate that formulation, my brother. You see, for me, I begin with human fallibility. And by fallibility, what I mean is that whatever lens through which we view the world, no one of us can ever have a monopoly on truth, capital T. We can have access to truth, small t's, that are better than half truths and that are much better than lies. But in the end, truth, capital T, is still a kind of mystery. Now, I'm not a mystic, but I believe in the crucial role of mystery. There's something that's always bigger than our human hearts and minds and souls and bodies have access to. So that I'm very informed by the Nietzschean critique of Plato, when Nietzsche says that the distinction between reality and appearance can be overly simplistic, because it might be just a series of appearances that are appearing in different contexts. And that if we never have access to reality, capital R, like Kant's Ding on Zinc, like Kant's thing in and of itself, right? That the human mind, the conceptual schemes, never have access to. It's always mediated with fallible conceptual schemes. And I resonate with that Nietzschean critique. I resonate with the Kantian sensibility that we never have direct access to the Ding on Zinc, the thing in itself, reality, capital R, truth, capital T. That's just human fallibility. Now, that does not lead toward a relativism or a sophomoric nihilism. It leads toward a contextualism, that what the lens through which we view the world are always in certain historical context, which means that we can still see much, but we can never see everything. Or as Adorno put it in that wonderful section 29 of Minimum Moralia, that wonderful little section on got the quiet force. He says, the splinter in one's own eye is the biggest magnifying glass.
Mm-hmm.
The splinter in one's eye is the biggest magnifying glass. And that's a formulation of Jesus's words in the 7th chapter of Matthew, where he talks about the mote and the beam in one's eye ought to humble oneself, because no one has direct access to truth. We ought to be sensitive to the insights people have, but also mindful of their shortcomings, because we have insights, but we also have shortcomings. Now, what is that to say? It is to say then that the quest and the pursuit of truth is endless, it's perennial for fallible, finite creatures, for temporal historical organisms like ourselves with language. But it means then that we have to be even more courageous in our quest for truth. And I would add beauty, I would add goodness, and I would also add the holy. Now, what does that mean? It means then that our conceptions of human nature are always already informed by certain conceptions of fallibility and finitude and historicity and temporality, which makes it always contextual. And if it's always contextual, then we ought to be self-critical. We ought to be mindful of our shortcomings, mindful of our splinters in our eyes, as it were. But we ought to be even more vigilant in our attempt to engage in quest for truth and goodness and justice and so forth. So that you're absolutely right. I mean, Plato makes so much of the reality versus appearance distinction. It sits at the very center of his project that serves as the basis of the critique of the poets. He believes the poets never get to reality. All they have is imitations of imitations of imitations. All they have are appearances of appearances of appearances, or the accumulation of simulacra. of copies, 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 never getting at reality, capital R. And you see, I have a deep disagreement with Plato. I believe that philosophy should not be over against poetry. It ought to go to school with the poets. I actually believe that philosophy ought to go to school with the musicians. Because you remember, Plato bans the flute in the Republic. And this is a very important move. Now, he doesn't just ban most of the poets. The only poets he allows are the poets who will write poetry to actually exalt the gods and to praise great men. Those are the only poets he admits, but he does away with the flute and only allows the lyre with one string. Why? Because the flute itself appeals to non-rational aspects of who we are, and he's trying to create his hierarchical chain of being. He's trying to create his good state tied to good life, given the hierarchical rankings that he put forward. And he wants to do that by ensuring that you don't have appeals to the non-rational sides of people, especially the philosophers. Now, as a jazz man and as a blues man, you see, I believe, in fact, that you can never think that you can overlook or overcome the non-rational. The question is, how do you appeal to the non-rational in such a way that it's tied to compassion and love and sensitivity and tenderness and sweetness and kindness? That's a certain kind of paideia that's grounded in the intersection of the appetites and the instincts and the habits and the practices. And so it's a very different sensibility. I'm much more tied to poets and musicians than Plato is. He wants rationality and a certain kind of logos confined to argument and rational narrative. I want that plus something else. I'm not against philosophy. I'm not against science. But I just think that human beings are the kind of organisms where we have to come to terms with how they wrestle with death, dread, despair, disappointment, suffering, crisis, and catastrophe. And you can't have a philosophical discourse about death, dread, despair, and disappointment if you're concerned solely about the rational. If you're concerned solely about a narrow conception of logos, is what Whitehead called one-eyed reason. Beautiful, beautiful phrase. And I think that's in the Adventures of Ideas, that great classic of his that he wrote in the 30s. So that I'm not anti-science, I'm not anti-philosophy, but I think we need a robust conception of philosophy that's grounded in a blues tradition. And in that blues and jazz tradition, it's one in which the poets and the musicians and the philosophers are in dialogue with each other in a respectful way. But there's a splinter in the eye of all of them.
Additionally, Professor Cornel West, having witnessed these phenomenal lectures that you've been giving as a professor at some of the leading universities in the country, Princeton, Harvard, the seminar itself, and so on, I've always been impressed by the philosophical rigor through which you look at the fluidity of the self as it embodies itself in sex and gender, for example. Following the great Judith Butler, you are the only philosopher who is seeking a public office, who is engaging what it means to identify yourself with this sex, with that gender, on philosophical grounds as fluidity. I would like you to work that out for me, because some of your greatest admirers, whom I hope are going to vote for you in floods, in numbers, are going to do so because you're engaging their identities, their ways of life, their ethics, the meaning of their own existence as young as they are. instead of simply dismissing them or shallowly looking at what it means to have an identity. Perhaps at the expense of tiring you, we could do some reflection on that.
Boy, these questions are so powerful, though, brother. This is such a unique interview, as is always the case, going back to the talks that we had at my office in Cambridge now a number of years. I believe very deeply in notions of embodiment and enactment when it comes to discussions about human beings. In some ways, it's very Aristotelian. In some ways, it's very Whiteheadian. These days, it's primarily talked about by some of the great feminist philosophers and feminist social theorists, of which Judith Butler is one of the grandest, no doubt about that. But in talking about embodiment and enactment, it means then that by trying to keep track of people's precious humanity, because you see, in the end, I really am still an old school humanist that's motivated with my own Christian sensibilities, what it really means for organisms who are made in image and likeness of God and have a certain sanctity and dignity and fluidity, because they're temporal creatures, they're historical creatures, they're changing over time, and a whole lot is changing, not just their opinions, not just their viewpoints, but their identities are changing. Sometimes their very sexual genders are changing, and so forth and so on. But it's really the humanity that I'm trying. You take Precious Trans, it's their humanity I want to stay in contact with. You see, the Wachowskis, were kind enough to have me in The Matrix, and both of them engaged in gender transformation. Their rich humanity, also geniuses in terms of artists, but it's their humanity that I want to stay in contact with, even as they're undergoing various kinds of metamorphoses, transformations, and changes that they choose in light of who they conceive themselves to be and who they like to be. And so I try to say to every fellow human being that I'm fundamentally concerned with their dignity and their sanctity, whatever kinds of changes and transformations they undergo.
Incredible. I am fully satisfied. And now, as time is fast approaching, because you have so many campaigns to attend to, allow me to ask just two more questions.
Sure.
If you have time.
Absolutely.
If you don't mind, because I have promised you that I won't keep you beyond 45 minutes. But you're so titanic intellectually that I can't help but pursue you selfishly. So my last two questions are going to be the following. Let me begin with the first. I would like us to engage this interpenetration, as it were, of race and class that underlies and motivates your quest to take human beings seriously, including those who've been designated as Trumpites, so on the grounds that they could be appealed to are thinking human beings, provided that you exemplify enough respect and also exhibit interest in their ways of life, in their ethics, and then address them as human beings. And central to the possibility of performing this is to work out that interpenetration of race and class, particularly in a racist society, where race, as an appearance, to return to the Platonic theme, has become a second nature, and it's so difficult to engage it. I experience this in classes every day, having been teaching philosophy for almost 40 years now. It is so difficult because it's an appearance that has glued itself to the self, and the self finds it difficult to disengage itself from these appearances of race and class.
No, that's so true. I always begin, especially these days, any discussion about race and class with empire. You see, the race is very much a modern notion. It's a modern construct that was rooted in, on the one hand, predatory capitalist processes that were extended across national boundaries, in many ways across the ocean. We talk about the Europeanization of the world beginning in 1492 and bringing with it these deeply white supremacist notions of non-European peoples. And because they're predatory capitalist processes, they already have with them deep class-centered orientations. So that the very notion of modernity, which is very much a creation of European empires extending themselves across the globe and around the world and carrying with them capitalist processes in which class is central, and then deeply white supremacist processes in which race is central. And the two are so intertwined because they're looking both for labor markets, namely African workers, after the engagement with our indigenous brothers and sisters, and them not being able to pull off a project in which indigenous brothers and sisters serve as the center of their labor force, they found it in Africa. So that race and class historically, this is the makings of the modern world. This is the makings of the Europeanization of the world. And we're dealing with those legacies up until now. Now, after 1945, the Europeanization of the world is basically over and Americanization takes over. And that Americanization is based very much on the Europeanization, but it's not the same thing. It's over against the Soviet Empire for a while, but that collapsed very quickly between 1945 and 1991, because the end of the Age of Europe was 1945. The Bolshevik Revolution is 1917. But by 1991, there's no countervailing force against the Americanization of the world. The American empire is in the driver's seat. Just like at this very moment, 45% all military exports, America. It's unbelievable. There's never been an empire like that in what sits at the center of the American empire. Not just capitalist processes, but white supremacy because of the slavery as the fundamental foundation of the American democratic project. Yeah, there's some wonderful things about the American empire. We could talk about Louis Armstrong and Sarah Vaughan and Stephen Sondheim and Melville and some Curtis Mayfield and some other beautiful individuals who constitute traditions in it. But we know economically speaking and politically speaking, it sits at the very center of the capitalist expansion and white supremacy as rationalization of those capitalist processes in which non-European peoples are treated less than human, and their labor would produce the wealth that would constitute the precondition for the United States. For the United States. In the same way, actually, that the Europeanization of the world really in some ways also begins at a moment in which Jews are expelled internally in Spain in 1492 from Europe. And it ends in 1945, the inability to come to terms with the precious humanity of Jews, with the concentration camps, of the gangsters, of Hitlers and the Nazis and others. Well, in the Americanization of the world, the blowback is indigenous peoples and Black peoples, because the underside of Americanization is genocide of indigenous peoples, enslavement of African peoples. Just as a fundamental dynamic of the Europeanization of the world was the vicious treatment of Jews, the pogroms, the marginalizations, the brandings, and then the culmination with the concentration camps and so forth. Now, there's a whole lot of other things going on, but those are crucial markers. And there's no accident that the great prophetic figures of the Americanization of the world, that goes all the way back to W.B. Du Bois and Harriet Tubman, and culminates in some ways with James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, says what? That white supremacy will bring down the curtain on the American empire. Why? Because race and class and gender are always intertwined, but the inability to come to terms with that white supremacy will bring down the curtain in the same way that the curtain was brought down on the Europeanization of the world in 1945, marked by the inability to come to terms with the humanity of Jews, but tied to a whole host of other phenomena, as we know, nationalisms and anti-communisms and trashing of socialists and anarchists and the organized greed of the fascists that were in the driver's seat for leading toward the catastrophe in 1945. And I'm saying this not because you can lay out all of this in a clear manner very quickly. You really had to move step by step for people to see the overall argument. I'm just giving a sketch of the outline of the context. And then the question becomes, well, what happens to the fate of philosophy, the plight of philosophy, given these conditions? And I tell you, my brother, one of the major blind spots of philosophers has always been that of Karl von Clausewitz and his great work on war. You don't get a lot of philosophers understanding the crucial role of war and organized force in shaping societies, in shaping nation states, in shaping civil societies. Philosophy remains too far attached from the real world, and we know war has always been a fundamental phenomenon. Same is true for empires. If you look at the history of philosophical reflection and see how many philosophers have really hit empire head on, and you know better than all of us in so many ways, when it comes to going back to pre-modern philosophical reflections in Egypt and how race became tied into it and how gender became tied into it. It's only recently, in the last 20 or 30 years, that the profession of philosophy even woke up and recognized that race and gender and empire were fundamental.
Incredible. Indeed. And Professor Cornel West, you are one of the few philosophers, in my judgment, who has taken Fanon seriously,
Yes.
Whose name you courageously invoke, because his name has been demonized as the apostle of violence, which he is not. He is the first, correct me if I'm wrong, who saw the interpenetration of race and class, in which it says the notion of class, as fertile and as powerful as it is, has to be stretched so that it can have a space for race. That is a remarkable insight.
That's right.
Here you have an attempt to address both and gently asking that we stretch the notion of class so that it can embrace race. We cannot remove race because it is tied to class. But if we stretch class, if we did not stretch it so that it won't break down, but stretch it sufficiently, then we will locate race inside it because it is intertwined with it.
Absolutely. Remember the great Stuart Hall used to say that race is the prism in which class lives, and class is the prism in which race lives. But I would say this, I mean, one of the joys of my intellectual life was to be asked to write the new introduction to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, the 60th anniversary, by his beloved daughter, Paris. And in doing that, I was able to reflect precisely on the greatness of Fanon in terms of his notions of decolonization. Decolonization that does precisely what you noted. It stretches Marxist analysis, but attempts to understand the ways in which class and race are simultaneously enacted and articulated, and then understand it again against the backdrop of empire. Because see, Fanon understood that the end of the age of Europe was primarily driven by its opposition to the decolonization of the world, not just the so-called third world. Europe itself needed to be decolonized. In the same way, America itself needs to be decolonized. It can't be the empire that dictates the policies of other nations and has a total spectrum of domination. No, it's a nation among nations that doesn't have to try to force nations to defer. And when they don't defer, there's invasion and occupation. We've seen that in the history of American empire, which is military, not just in Latin America, but around the world, recently in Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and so forth. So Fanon understood that decolonization was going to be one of the fundamental sources for the next wave of how humanity had to come to terms with its catastrophes. And he called for what? A new humanism, a new conception of humanity that built on the best of Europe. You've understood this so well. You're one of the grand ones that understand a dialectical understanding of the West. The West has its crimes, but we can still learn from the West at its best. But at its worst, the crimes are barbaric. At its best, there's insights. And Fanon says the same thing. We can learn from the European traditions and heritages, but from the vantage point of the colonized, pushing for decolonization. And what is decolonization? Well, in many ways, it's a matter of course, he's a socialist, so he wants to decommodify those mechanisms that are responsible for satisfying the basic social needs of people, of healthcare and education and housing and jobs and quality relations. There's got to be some democratic oversight. If it's just the market, if it's just commodification that sits at the center of those, it's over. Because the strong are going to, and the greedy are going to seize it, and the weak will have nothing. The weak will be dangling. So that you're right. I mean, I think Fanon is one of the indispensable voices, figures, philosophers, and he understands the crucial role of the psychic, what I would call the personality and the soul. The sense of being demeaned and degraded and having no confidence and having little self-respect and self-esteem and self-regard, especially if you've been hated and terrorized and traumatized for 400 years. Frantz Fanon understood that coming out of Martinique and being trained in France. And of course, we can't mention him without his teacher, Amos Césaire. But we could go on in terms of that coterie of figures. But at the same time, you know, I've got my disagreements with Fanon as well, because I tend to be much more closer to Martin King when it comes to the roles of violence. He has a cathartic conception of violence, in which certain kinds of violence has a cleansing effect and so forth and so on. And I'm not convinced of that, but I understand the nature of his claim, but I'm not convinced of that. But that's part and parcel of what philosophical discourse is all about. Incredible. Because none of us have a monopoly on truth. We learn from one another, we push one another, we challenge one another, and in the end, we hope we come up stronger because we interacted with one another.
Incredible. Which invariably led me to admire very deeply your response to the situation of Israeli babies who, to use your term, were victims of an ugly violence, which is precisely, I think, an exemplification of your tentative endorsement of violence, and that it may not always be a cleansing force, but rather a destructive one. I appreciate that. It was courageous, although it enraged the left.
And it's important to make that distinction, brother, because unlike Martin King and Desmond Tutu, Desmond was my dear brother, I love very deeply. We used to argue this all the time in the middle of the night, that I'm not a pacifist. You see, I believe in just war. I believe that you can attack property sites. I believe that you can attack military combatants in a context of war. I just have no patience whatsoever for the killing of innocent people, no matter who they are, Israeli, Palestinian, Ethiopian, Lithuanian, Russian, Guatemalan, and so forth. For me, those constitute war crimes. And of course, you have war crimes institutionalized under decades-long occupations and decades-long domination, in which innocent people are being killed daily and monthly. Those are war crimes over and over again. And we've seen this under the vicious Israeli occupation. But at the same time, I refuse to in any way look away from the killing of innocent people. It could be Hamas killing innocent Israelis. It could be U.S. soldiers killing, innocent Vietnamese children. I mean, whatever actors they are, there's got to be some role for accenting the moral dimension of this barbaric situation, even given the history of these very ugly occupations and dominations and so forth.
Yes, I personally deeply appreciate the brilliance and consistency of your humanity, this consistent rendition of the preciousness of Palestinian babies, Ethiopian babies, and Israeli babies is not only original, but humbly enlightening. Humanity needs it. My final question is the following, and it's really the final one, but it has to be addressed. Your admirers among the members of the left are upset with you after you made a move to run as an independent. Among other things, they contend that organizing the working class in particular, organizing the marginalized, is going to require a political party. As you know, this is not a new debate. It was a debate, for example, that was fiercely fought in Italian Marxism. My first book was a book on Antonio Gramsci, between Bordiga, who was a consummate admirer of the political party, and Antonio Gramsci, who was struggling with the idea of democratizing human lives at the workplace through what he then called factory councils. I know you know this literature inside and out. I would like us to end our philosophical discourse today by thinking deeply about what organization means to you.
Well, one is that you are absolutely right that Gramsci, towering figure that he is. I mean, other than Vico and Aquinas, he's probably the greatest Italian philosopher in the history of Italy. And he understood the relation between organizational capacity and intellectual articulation, or what he called elaboration, that wonderful word that Edward Said used to talk about with such power. I can see him talking about that right now in the classroom at Columbia, teaching Gramsci. But you see, in the United States, the left is so weak and it is so feeble. The United States is a profoundly conservative culture and a profoundly capitalist society. So that when the left ever attempts to be strong, it usually is crushed militarily with the FBI, crushed internally with spies and so forth. And because the American capitalist economy has so many carrots that you end up with trade union movements that are business unions rather than militant unions. You have Black leadership that is more and more neoliberal because they accept the carrots of the capitalist society and the various forms of status rather than being in solidarity with poor and working people. So that historically it's been very, very difficult to create and sustain a party. It could be communist, it could be socialist, it could be leftist, whatever, on the American terrain. Trotsky used to say when he was in Mexico before Stalin viciously had him killed, he said, America is in need of a fundamental revolution, but one wonders whether it has the capacity to undergo such a revolution because of its weak left organizations. He's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. So what does one do at this particular historical moment? Well, if you initiate an attempt of creating a political party, that's a 30 or 40-year operation. I'm not against it, But things are at such a state of emergency that we've got to do something to at least allow the left tradition to be made visible and accessible to a younger generation. I thought the Green Party could do that, but it turned out it's just too weak and feeble itself and dysfunctional. And I would have to spend so much time dealing with internal Green Party dynamics rather than going directly to the people. They had all kind of 4 debates and going to state gatherings and all the webinars of the Green Party. I got to get out and see the people. And the Green Party is not a mass-based party at all. I kicked off in Mississippi with the Emmett Till family and with Jenkins and Parker, who have been brutalized by the police. You go down there and you mention the Green Party, black folk ain't never heard no Green Party in Mississippi. Even though the Green Party is there, they just hadn't heard of it. It doesn't have that kind of visibility. I'm not putting them down. This is just a reality. Now, of course, what I gave up was those 17 states that they have ballot access. And we as independent now, much freer, speak our minds, not tied to Green Party process of nomination, that we can get 15 or 18 states fairly easily. And we hope we can end up with about 35, but we may end up with 35 states or so rather than the 42 that Sister Jill Stein and Brother Jamu Baraka had. Now, what I do agree with the critique of Baraka and others that say, well, part of the challenge of running independent is that you can end up running an individualistic campaign. Yes. That focuses primarily on you. Now, they're right about that. But I don't think that individualism is the same as independent. You can be an independent candidate who still puts the people at the center of what you're doing, tied to whatever movements in your backdrop without a party. And they're saying the only way you can have a people-centered movement is to have a party. I said, well, the Green Party's been out here since 1991, and they're not the most visible organization when it comes to voices on the left. They pop up every 4 years. I had long talks with Brother Ralph Nader, who I love deeply, and he told me explicitly, Brother West, the internal dynamics of the Green Party is going to be a distraction for you. You need to run independent. He told me that from the very beginning. And he ran on the Green Party, and he also ran independent at the same time. He said, if I have to do it again, I would definitely run independent. Now, Ralph Nader, you know, is somebody who knows what he's talking about. He's 89 years young, still strong as he can be in Washington, D.C., and I stay in contact with him. But he's just one example. Same would be true with Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges told me the same thing. He introduced me to the Green Party, saw what was going on, and said it's a good idea to leave. See, I take Chris Hedges very, very seriously. I love that brother. He's one of the towering figures on the left as well. But all of us, again, you know, we learn from each other. I just hope that we can have some overarching solidarity. That's because the left historically being so weak, if we're at each other's throats, then we get even weaker. But I'm going for the everyday people. I'm going for the masses. And the masses, they're not privy to all these left-wing internal differences and dynamics. They don't really follow that at all. They just want somebody with integrity, honesty, decency, courage, that has an all-embracing vision of humanity that's not even Amerocentric, but understands the centrality of every country in the world, the centrality of Africa, the centrality of the global South, as we move toward climatic catastrophe, as we move toward possible nuclear catastrophe, as we move toward more and more wars over water and a whole host of other things, and to do it in such a way that you still have a smile and you still have your style with your tremendous spirituality and your tenacity, fighting, fighting, fighting.
Incredible. Of course, you can imagine how excited I am to continue interviewing you. I wish it was possible to interview you for 3 hours without I haven't even begun the interview. but I have to thank you deeply from the nerve center of my being for giving time to African Ascent International, and in my judgment, gave us a historic interview as a philosopher and as a politician with a moral disposition, which was Kant's dream. Kant's dream was the cultivation of a politician with a moral disposition. What we call politics need not necessarily be ugly and self-centered. It could be anchored on the morals themselves, as the great Noam Chomsky has been arguing linguistically for the past 23 years. I wish you well, and I thank you again.
Thank you so much, my dear brother. I salute you. Love you, man.
Thank you so much.
Definitely. All right.